Professor Nick Cowen, thanks for being here.
Great to be here. Thanks for this interesting dialogue that you're setting up.
Can you share a time when you changed a long-held belief and what influenced that change?
So there's a few examples I could draw on. I think perhaps the most explicit change of belief would be regarding male circumcision. So quite a controversial area. I come from a Jewish background, and it's quite a strong cultural tradition and a religious tradition. It was more of a cultural tradition in my family because we're not particularly religious. And for a long time, I would defend circumcision on the grounds it's not particularly harmful so far as we can tell in the long run, and it's not intended to be harmful, and that it's like basically a very long held and strong kind of cultural tradition that goes back, I don't know, maybe 5,000 years. It's hard to know exactly when it began. And so, and I suppose I kind of defended it out of, a sense of inclusion with that cultural tradition. And I suppose an element of pride in the identity, that kind of thing. And I suppose when I was thinking about like its justification more broadly, I'd always sort of run up against the rather different experience of female circumcision, or what is more commonly called, female genital mutilation. And I'd say there are all these ways in which the two are different. And I still think they are different because they're usually intended to do very different things, in terms of what they mean for the place of men and women in society and that kind of thing. But as I kind of read more of the literature and I kind of was exposed to more of the critical arguments, I realized that although male circumcision is not generally harmful, it can still cause harm, not for any particularly good reason. I noticed that there were some various hygiene and medical arguments for it, and actually, generally speaking, it's like any broadly surgical intervention, it's always got risks. So you want to like not do it if you could possibly avoid it. And at the same time, the benefits are kind of really over-egged. They're not really there so far as we can tell. And we don't really know what the harms are. So there's a kind of an assumption that because we don't really have memory of pain when we're young, that the experience of a kind of genital cutting couldn't affect us because we just don't have any memory of it. And I think that although the trauma of like early childhood experiences might be kind of like better evidenced in the future, the idea that just because people don't remember a painful experience doesn't mean it hasn't affected them. That idea has kind of been challenged, quite substantially. So I guess overall, I kind of come around to the idea that it's at least a moral wrong. And perhaps in some, in the right political circumstances, it would probably be a good idea to prohibit it because it's kind of unnecessary cultural imposition on children that should be considered, as kind of growing autonomous actors in their own right, who ought to be able to choose how to handle and modify their bodies as they wish, as they become more able and more cognitively aware, and will have freedom to do so once they're adults rather than childhood circumcision.
Has this changed belief translated to any other strongly held beliefs that you hold?
I suppose the advantage of this one is quite easy because it's like it's a very specific thing which doesn't affect that much of my life, so it just when it comes up in debates and things, and maybe like how if I have a family, how I'm going to like handle our cultural traditions, so I'm going to like look at that more. But I suppose the advantage of this particular belief is that it's not like that connected with other beliefs. I suppose it has, because of the centrality of this tradition, of this kind of practice to Judaism, it's kind of made me take a more critical look at Judaism in general. And like, so for example, I don't worry about the dietary laws at all anymore. I used to kind of like think about it. I'd feel, I try and avoid pork if I possibly could, that sort of thing. And now I don't worry about that because it's like, yeah, it's well, once you've kind of said, no, we're not going to do this thing, then all the other laws kind of look comparatively minor. So yeah, it hasn't changed my identity as a kind of culturally Jewish person too much, though.
Are there any beliefs you feel you will never abandon and why?
I suppose the underlying value of human beings as individuals would be like, so if you think about like the belief, the thing that made me change my belief was this kind of recognition that circumcision was a kind of way of marking someone non-consensually as a member of a community and in a way that kind of violates their bodily integrity. And so I suspect that the underlying fundamental belief is about trying to treat people as individuals, which means either respecting their actual choices, or if they're the sort of person who either temporarily or permanently cannot make choices for themselves. Like, for example, maybe they've become demented. You have to think about their interests as individuals as well, not just what the interests are for the community or for the group. So I guess that's, yeah, so I guess that would be a fundamental, quite an abstract belief, really. And everything else is kind of a little bit around is in a sense up for grabs.
What does it mean to disagree well?
I suppose it's seeing other people's point of view. And I mean, my experience of disagreeing well is to try and abstract my beliefs from myself. So you kind of like think, okay, look, I have these beliefs, maybe about the primacy of the individual. Maybe I come across someone who has a fundamental disagreement with that. They think the community is the most important thing, maybe, or that family, like commitment to family or following, and I suppose the important thing is to take that abstract idea that I take to be fundamental and to go like, okay, that's within me, but I'm going to put that on the table now and say this is kind of what this is now something that's kind of up for debate. And then when I think about why I have that fundamental belief, I kind of realize that from a moral psychological perspective, it probably emerges from certain personality traits that I have. And I didn't choose my personality traits. So on some level, I choose my beliefs, but the traits that I have, which are sort of like, I would say as being fairly conscientious, so kind of worried about the way that I impact other people, very open-minded. When I take the Big Five personality test, that always comes up as something that comes along. And that would kind of like, that would sort of be a good indicator of individualism, as like a sort of that kind of thing. And so once I've kind of abstracted and go like, okay, these are my traits and these are my beliefs, and then go like, well, someone who is more closed-minded, not in a kind of pejorative way, but someone who just literally thinks that it's generally a good thing for people to follow the norms of their community. To think that that's a good way of living. It's a good way that humans live. That's like their kind of attitude. I can now understand that just as I have this kind of like this sort of natural propensity to kind of like explore and think about alternative ways of being, which makes me a good academic. It's quite, sort of, I think when you look at academics, they tend to be quite neurotic, but also quite open-minded. That tends to be like typical personality traits. Then I can say, okay, so they're just going to feel that pull towards respect for norms in a way that I just feel that kind of urge to explore. So I can now understand, their disposition, and perhaps, I can understand their disposition is going to be as strongly held as my disposition. And so maybe there might be some common ground to be found there, but at least I can understand that their disagreement comes from something as authentic and as human as my point of view.
Do you think there's more benefit or harm to separating cultural factors or the person from the disagreement?
So cultural factors, I think it probably is worthwhile separating cultural factors from individual traits, because I think that people's attitudes to their own culture varies quite a big deal from one individual to another. So, just because you're born into a culture doesn't mean that you follow it uncritically. So in that sense, if you're trying to establish where the disagreement comes from, then you probably do need to differentiate the person from the culture, because if you're dealing with someone who is, has low openness to experience, so is kind of relatively closed-minded on a personality side, then whatever culture they happen to have been born into, they're quite likely to hold on to strongly. But it's not necessarily the culture that's making them like make these kind of decisions in these ways. It might in fact be the fact that they've got these underlying personality traits. So I think from the point of view of understanding where the disagreement lies, I think it is worth separating the culture from the person. But cultural factors are probably, they matter as well, because different cultures also kind of push people in different directions. So I also happen to come from a more individualistic culture, not the Jewish culture. Jewish culture is actually quite collectivist, but the British culture, which I'm being born into, that's pretty individualist. There are slightly more individualistic cultures out there, but this is pretty individualist. And so, yes, it's kind of worth bearing in mind that like my view as a kind of like a liberal who's ultimately become a little bit more critical of certain religious practices is also culturally embedded. So it's worth it for self-understanding as well.
What are the benefits of unresolved disagreement, if you think there are any?
The benefits of unresolved disagreement. Well, I suppose if it encourages further critical engagement, then that's valuable. I mean, I tend to be quite Millian in that idea that I think that the progress comes from disagreement. So without disagreement, we wouldn't consider the way that we're doing things now and how they might be done more successfully in the future. So I think that that progress comes from disagreement. And so if all disagreements were resolved, then that would imply that we were in a situation where, where we couldn't think of any possible ways in which things could be better. Now, if it's because we are genuinely in the best possible of all possible worlds, then maybe we don't need disagreement anymore. But I don't think that we're going to be there. I think the other thing is that people do benefit from maybe having different status hierarchies that value things differently, especially in a complex society. So I might have a position as a professor, I'm in a hierarchy, and so I'm in a position of authority in various circumstances, during my life, especially during my working life. And that's something that I enjoy. And if that was the only status hierarchy, in other words, if teachers and intellectuals and academics were at the very top of everything, like that was considered the one thing that you should care about, then that would mean that people who were not so academically gifted would always be in a position of inferiority in every interaction that they were in. So that would not be a very egalitarian society. So disagreement over like what values are important could be useful for allowing people to kind of switch up their status hierarchies a bit. So, for example, I recently tried making a watch. It hasn't worked out so well so far, but I was kind of very curious about how they worked. And so I kind of got into it. And so in that respect, I'm a novice. And if I go along to a workshop, I mean, to be honest, I don't really have the, I mean, it's hard being a novice again. I'll admit it. But if I went along to a trained watchmaker and tried to learn there, I would once again be, in a lower like status in terms of like intellectual, craftsmanship than them. But the fact that people have these possibilities of valuing different things differently means that one can be moving from environment to environment where you might be in a high status in one moment and a relatively low status another, and it means that people get an opportunity to be the important person in one of their environments where they're particularly, where their particular traits and skills are particularly valued. I'm not sure if you need disagreement for that, but I think it's associated with disagreement being present in society.
Finally, how can schools and universities promote good disagreement?
Well, that's a difficult one because, you need to making sure that people are well behaved and learning, kind of more instrumentally for their, university studies and for their other things with, with that need for mindedness. But I think that taking kind of philosophical approach, which is the sort of thing that I've kind of said here, where you say, okay, let's take some values and let's put them on the table and think about how they work, like think about how they're connected, think about the underlying values that they refer to. I think that can be a good way of developing, a kind of sense of fruitful disagreement. And I think that another aspect of it probably comes from fundamental respect for people's humanity. So it can be difficult dealing with cultural differences because people might have a sense of identity that might be connected to their religion, their ethnicity, maybe increasingly their sexual and gender identity. So people might feel that very, very strongly, and yet people might disagree over the way these identities and categories ought to work. That can be like a difficult and fraught fundamental disagreement. And it's difficult to know exactly where, because a lot of debates, in universities, but I suspect also in schools, is this issue of like, you cannot discuss something because even the use of language is disputed. So the kind of the way that language is used to identify people and identify particular practices is kind of used, it's assumed to be pejorative or assumed to be bringing in lots of implications. And sometimes it is, sometimes it's intended to be hurtful. So I think firstly, you want to say that you should not be in an environment where you're intending to hurt the other side. So, like if you hurt them by accident, then that's a different matter. But if you shouldn't be intending to be malicious. And I think the other side is avering everyone's fundamental humanity. So you say, look, we might disagree over some of these other categories, but in terms of like, your rights as a human being, however you identify, we respect you as human and your right to exist. So I think that's kind of an important starting point, at least.